Hey, I'm Megan Milbourne, and I'm coming to you today to talk a little bit about the concept of Isvara Pranidhanadva. So that's a lot of Sanskrit, very clumsily pronounced because I'm not the type of Sanskrit scholar as Manorma and some of these really amazing teachers. But I can talk to you a bit about the concept. So the concept of Isvara Pranidhanadva is found in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. So these are some of the first texts that we have about yoga. And they come to us as a teaching on how to attain the state of yoga. So we know yoga both as practices, right? So most commonly, a yoga practice, a yoga class is what in this terms is referred to as asana, as movement. And for those of you who are pretty serious yoga students, you know that there are other limbs of yoga. So the practices of yoga, well, they include asana, they also include self-reflection, they also include our behaviors with one another, like the yamas, they include meditation and pranayama or breath practice. So these are the practices, but towards what ends? Like, why are we doing asana or pranayama or any of these things? Why is Patanjali suggesting we do these things? So the state of yoga is somewhat distinct from the practice of yoga. And the state of yoga is really esoteric, so people describe it in many different ways. But one of the ways that I like to think of it is the state in which nothing is missing. So many of us know that yoga, state and practice, comes from the Sanskrit word, root word, yuj, which is to yoke. So it's this idea of yoking our individuated selves back to that collective consciousness, or remembering our individual selves as we're connected to the all. Right? So all of these practices are towards attaining the state, right? We do the asana so that we can remember we are connected to all things. We do the pranayama so that we can remember ourselves, put ourselves back together and feel that sense of integration and connection to all. So we can do any of these practices, but the practices I've been sort of laying out as an illustration to explain this point are practices that Patanjali gives us sort of like down the line. They're part of the Ashtanga yoga path, the 8-limbed yoga path. But there's like a more direct way. So the first way that Patanjali tells all of us students of yoga, to understand our connection, to remember ourselves, to achieve the state of yoga, is to practice Isvara Pranidhanadva. So Isvara is what I like to say, our own personal Jesus, right? So an Isvara is an avatar. It's an understanding of the divine. So Ganesh, for example, is an Isvara. Saraswati is an Isvara. Shiva, Kali. These are all understandings of the divine. Like they are an aspect of the divine. But in this tradition, like in Hinduism as well as in yoga and these other practices that were kind of all developing at the same time and place and mutually informing one another. So in this practice, those are Ishwaras, but they're all just aspects of the whole. So Pranidhanadva is often translated as surrendering, like surrendering to your understanding of the divine, or your hair as it starts to pop up, right? So having a direct relationship with whoever you understand the divine to be, Brahma, Vishnu, Krishna, whoever it is, and surrendering. Okay, so there's a lot in that tends to feel somewhat challenging to many of us, especially those of us, I think, in the West, where we come from a really materialist worldview, meaning we're like, okay, if I see it, I understand it, it kind of makes sense, or a scientific worldview, none of which are a bad thing, and none of which are necessarily contradictory to this worldview. But I think it takes like a little bit of sort of working with and developing a familiarity with this way of thinking about things. So some people would get really strict about what's an acceptable Ishvara, and often it's going to be within the canon of Hindu deities. So somebody like Krishna or Radha or Saraswati, to develop a relationship with one of these figures and like a true relationship. So thinking of them as your friend or as your lover, yeah, or as like a parent or child, like to really have a real relationship. And those different relationships, also like servant and master, those often are kind of illuminated in the Bhakti tradition. So some people take maybe a little bit more of a liberal perspective on this. And I've had teachers who are like, it's okay to look at your grandmother or an ancestor as your Ishvara, right? Like as a way that you understand the divine, as a connection, even if they're living or if they're not. Or even a quality, like the quality of nature or the quality of justice, to try to develop a relationship with it. So I think a couple of things happen when we develop a relationship with something that we think is bigger than ourselves. For one, any relationship that we're in, whether it's with our Ishvara or whether it's with our roommate or our parent, it reflects our own behaviors back to us. Like, I know myself differently than I did 15 years ago because I've been married to one guy for that time. So I've had to see like the things that make me get upset and reactive, and the things that make me feel like I'm loved, and the behaviors that are like wonderful. And in the same way, I constantly learn about myself in my work relationship, like with my colleagues or my boss, or I learn about myself through my parents, and when I kind of regress and I'm 15 with them again, even though in reality right now I'm 37, right? So there's all these ways that a relationship helps us see ourselves. And when we see ourselves, we can get a little bit more clear about our own intentions, our behaviors, the ways that we behave in the world that are really good and healthy, and maybe some of the ways that like limit us or set up patterns that aren't helpful anymore, like always showing up late to work and annoying people, like anything like that. Like we start to see and we're like, oh, here I feel like everyone's just always annoyed when they see me, but I'm actually contributing to that. Like this relationship is showing me that my behavior is contributing to this interaction. So I can clarify my behavior. I can change it. So I think Isvara Pranidhanadva is in large part so that we start to see ourselves. Like we start to see ourselves a little bit more clearly. Now, the Pranidhanadva is the surrender part. And I facilitate teacher trainings, and one of the many wonderful students who I've had the pleasure to work with said something pretty amazing earlier this year when we were talking about this concept, and the concept of surrender, that to so many of us feels really treacherous because it feels like a surrender, like a release of our will. And that feels really scary, especially when we have these backgrounds where we've had betrayals of trust. Like we've opened ourselves up and we haven't always been received with the level of consideration and care that we would hope to. So it's real and reasonable after that time to maybe like have a little bit more discernment. So it's tricky to think about like, why would we surrender, and like what does that look like, and how do we do that in a way that is wise and healthy and good for us and good for everybody involved. So this student had a definition of surrender that it's a tactical engagement for survival. Like, so for example, if you're like surrendering to a pirate ship, right? Like you make a tactical maneuver so that you can survive. And I was like, whoa, that's really interesting. So that is one way to approach having a relationship with an Ishvara, with whatever it is that you see as big, as a representation of the divine, to have a tactical maneuver, like to have some kind of relationship that you know is part of getting a sense of being mirrored and being seen, being able to see yourself when we're normal to ourselves. We're like, everyone talks the way I do. Everybody likes oatmeal in the morning. Like, what are you talking about? So that's one way to think about it. I think another way is just to kind of like have a gentler relationship. So when I was first introduced to this concept, I was like, yeah, that sounds pretty weird and like something I'm not terribly interested in. And over the years, it's kind of changed. So here are my suggestions if you're curious about developing a practice of Isvara Pranidhanadva. Pay attention to what you pay attention to. Like just notice if you go to a yoga studio and you see images of the divine, if there's someone who catches your eye. Or notice if you always happen to see a certain flower or a certain color, or if like your eye and your ear, your senses are just drawn in a particular direction. So I started having that maybe like 2 years ago, where I was always drawn to like running water, like water running over rocks in a stream. I was drawn towards feminine images, like feminine goddesses. And I've always been drawn to writers and creators. And I was even thinking about like my ancestors, my mom and my grandmothers, who were also artists and creators. And I just kind of kept circling around these elements. And at a certain point, it clicked for me. I was like, Saraswati. Saraswati embodies all these things. She's on a swan. She's by moving water. She's a goddess of knowledge and creativity. And so I was like, okay, I'm drawn to her. I don't know why, but I'm drawn to her. So let me see if I can cultivate a relationship with her. So I've tried to treat her as my friend. I've tried to just like invite her in and around. So I got Saraswati statues that I happened to see in this kind of process. And I've put them around my house and in places where I'm going to look. Like when I'm doing my dishes, there's a Saraswati statue that I can gaze on. And I've started chanting Saraswati mantras. Like I just looked up different mantras. I meditate. With mantras to do with Saraswati. I incorporated Saraswati into different like passwords, for like my daily life so that I would have to like type her as a mantra. I've just done a lot of different things to kind of invite her into my life. And as I've invited her in, kind of the reasons why I was drawn to her, like what element of myself I was trying to have a relationship with, it's becoming more clear to me. But it only could become clear to me in the process. Like it wasn't something I could just intellectually be like, I just read this chapter and now I understand that when you surrender to an Isvara, like you awaken some dormant part of yourself. Like we're more organic than that. We're more creative than that. And so this practice, while it seemed really weird and kind of esoteric and even scary, like, am I somehow signing up for a cult I'm not aware of? It's actually become really dear to me. It's not the only way to practice yoga, but Patanjali says it's a rather potent one. So if you're interested in this kind of stuff, I have a vinyasa yoga class where you can move and think about Saraswati. It's on my podcast, so check that out. And I have a lot of other resources for yoga teachers. They're all on my website under courses. So I hope there's something for you. Enjoy. Bye.